Hi, welcome back to Peaceful Passages with Theresa Bates and Sierra Onstead. Today, there's a couple different topics that we wanted to talk about. I wanted to cover just a little bit about money issues.
When it comes to inheritance and that sort of thing.
Right. There are some people out there that have been blessed to be able to have either a lot of just money or money,
Other assets,
property,
that kind of thing.
houses, and things like that. So if you know that there's a death that's imminent, or even if it's not imminent,
You still want to be prepared.
you definitely want to be prepared because, God forbid, there's car accidents,
Sudden death.
terrorism, violent death, those kind of things that can happen. So if you have large assets like that, one of the things that I want to encourage people to do is to be able to talk to a
Financial advisor.
there you go. I'm thinking money market. No, that's not quite the right word. A financial advisor, because they will show you how to shelter your money and how to protect it. Because the times that we live in, unfortunately, you're going to get taxed on death. When you die, you can't avoid taxes, which it just blows me away. But it does happen. There's a friend of mine that I met when I was taking care of his parents when I was working at hospice, and they had, we'll just say, a lot of assets, a lot of money in the bank. But with the program, he utilized all of the facilities for hospice, but hospice is a government-paid program, and a lot of times the government or different entities try to take as much money from you, try to get you to pay as much as you can. And I will respectfully say he's very savvy with his money, and he learned how to shelter all of the money, the house, the car,
All of it.
bank accounts, all of it. So that way hospice was able to pick up the bill. And when he did at one point have to put one of his parents in a facility, that didn't come out of his inheritance. Because he was using a hospice, the hospice pays for that. And there's ways to shelter your money. So if you have a lot of assets, things like that, please seek a financial advisor and shelter your money. You can do it way easier before, and it's very, very, very difficult to do it afterwards. And it's not often that you would get a reimbursement check.
Exactly.
It just doesn't happen that way.
Yeah. And one way we do it in our family, at least with my grandparents, is that kind of a way to get around death tax a little bit is that they're giving our inheritance to us now while they're still living, not only to get around that, but then they can also see the fruits of what we do with that inheritance. For instance, my grandparents are blessing me, but then they're also seeing that I'm investing that into my business, and they can see, wow, this is what, the blessing that is being passed down and how it's being used and that kind of thing.
So they're seeing their fruits of their labor being passed to you, how it's going to grow in the future.
Exactly.
That's actually beautiful. It's very beautiful. So there's a lot of different creative ways to shelter your money. You can either keep it. Some parents spend it. Sorry, kids, I'm spending your inheritance.
Yeah.
Others want to save it. There's different ways to shelter it. As with an attorney, I'm not.
You're not an attorney.
I'm not a financial advisor. But if you have been blessed with those kind of things, then seek it out. Ask questions. There is wisdom in a multitude of counsel. So find your niche and seek the help that you need and advice from the people that you're looking for.
Exactly, and in reference to our previous episode when you discussed the ultimate gift, like for those who are underage or maybe not so sure if you want to give your inheritance to them, you can provide a trust fund, and you can have certain qualifications that need to be met first before that person receives that monetary gift.
So, sometimes it's age, sometimes it's completing college, effectively completing college, and give them different milestones to be able to allot different money instead of just saying, here's your inheritance.
Have them work for it a little bit. Or at least be at a good place that you know that they're going to manage it well.
And the trust fund is actually a really, really good thing because they have different allotments of money, but they can't spend all of it all at once because people are people.
Yeah.
So, but I wanted to spend the majority of this time in this particular episode on grief, a little bit of types of loss. But as you see, we have a lot of different books on the table. And this is part of the blessing that you have. You have an awesome library of things. And I want to be able to get to that. But what are some of the different kinds of loss? I mean, we have loss of a spouse.
Loss of a spouse, a sibling, people in your community, your best friend, your pet, and different situations too. Like, for instance, when it comes to a sudden death, like whether it's suicide or terrorism or car accident or whatever it may be, those have varying different effects because one, you weren't prepared for it and it was tragic. So there's that added trauma to it.
Right.
And like, for instance, with like terrorism, like we are surrounded by it. Like, there's school shootings and there's car bombs and et cetera and those kinds of things.
We have the, we get touched by those things, and that community there has hands-on. But you were telling me during our break about some of the people in Israel, some of the things that they do there. Can you explain that for our guests, for our
viewers? Yes. Well, I was in Israel, praise Yah, in 2011, and so one thing that was really amazing to experience is while we were there, we got to visit a facility that specifically helped children whose parents were taken by terrorism. And so it was a facility to be able to help them heal, regain social skills, help them grow emotionally, help them heal. And like the way they view terrorism, because it's constant there's always this overhanging threat.
It's a daily thing that they're working through.
So either you can choose to be constantly afraid, I'm never going to leave my house, or I'm going to have my groceries delivered to me, or if I go outside, something might happen.
They're not living in fear.
They're not living in fear, and so they all just know this may happen, but I'm still going to live my life to the fullest. I'm going to embrace that l'chaim, and still be present and be there with my community and that kind of thing. And we need that perspective too, because we have that hope and that faith that no matter what happens, that God's got this.
Right. Well, one of the things that I not on purpose, but forgot to mention to you in some of the conversations as we're setting these things up, in Israel, there's a community or a group of volunteers. It's called Zaka, Z-A-K-A. And what Zaka does is, whether it's a car accident, murder, terrorism, or
sudden deaths,
any sudden death, what Zaka does is they have trained people. A lot of them are volunteer. They do have some paid staff, I believe, but they go in and they train people on how to clean up the scenes.
Yeah.
And our Israeli brothers and sisters, when it comes to things like this, they are so honoring and respectful to the body, because the body is created in the image of God. And so what they do is they clean the crime scene, whether it's get the blood off the floor or the walls. They also will put together clothing. They try to get everything intact as much as possible and put it with the deceased, so that way everybody is together. And if they can't put everything together, they at least will put things together, clothing, shoes, and different things like that, and they will bury it. So
because life's in the blood and it should be buried with the body.
Right. And they're so very trained with it. And it's an absolutely amazing program. And I could probably go on a little bit about that, but I want to focus a little bit more on the rest of our time on grief.
Okay.
And different types of grief.
Perhaps maybe explain the different stages that people might go through.
Well, one of the things that we're learning is you can find grief counseling, but if you look on the internet, and I've got a couple of handouts that I brought with me, but we're used to saying 5 stages of grief.
But it's much more complicated than that.
It's a lot more complicated. And when somebody is grieving, men and women sometimes grieve differently, where women, in general don't have too much of an issue to cry.
Yeah, they're more open with it. Guys, on the other
Right.
hand, societally have been taught not to.
Well, it's not as much that I've known some men that cry, and they're very manly men. But men generally, they don't want to show weakness, so
much more
their
reserved.
grief comes out as anger. But that's one of the stages of grief. So when I mentioned some of the different stages of grief, it doesn't happen stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4.
It's all over the place.
Right. And it is not just at death that grief happens. You could grieve the loss as, oh my gosh, I was just diagnosed with this. So you're grieving that. I remember in one of the other episodes I talked about my back surgery. I had to walk through the very, very real possibility that I would never have to walk again. There's a possibility that I could never walk again.
Which is
And
scary.
being an avid dancer, I had to work through that and struggle with that. So the different stages some people can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to completion. Most
and
of
you
us
might revisit
around.
different stages too.
Right.
You might
Or they're going to overlap. You know, like
feel all the feels at the same time.
like a wicker, like a
interwoven wicker basket.
There you go. I was going to say a wicker board, but that wasn't going to sound right. So some of the stages of grief, we have shock and denial. It's like, no, this isn't happening. I can't believe that
they're gone. Or like you pick up the phone, you're like, I can call them. Oh, they're not going to answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of my clients, she was so in denial that her husband was passing away that everybody knew, and she was so much in denial that she refused to sign a DNR, and her husband had Parkinson's, and it was at a point for a year that he couldn't speak, he couldn't do a lot of things, and so all that weight and that burden came upon her. But even the children, she absolutely refused to sign anything. So everybody had to be on board at that point to let him go.
Yeah.
And she still struggled when that event actually happened. But she was so still in denial
that she couldn't move forward.
Right. That when the death occurred, the family just kind of came around and really sat and embraced both of them. And that was about the only time that she could really start processing, because all the other emotion she just kind of tried to ignore. So we have the shock and grief, pain and guilt, anger. When you get mad, you start bargaining. God, well, if I can be healed from this, then
I'll go and do this for you, or whatever it is.
I'll do this. If you save me here, I'll go do this. Sometimes the father said yes, sometimes no. Each individual is very, very different in that respect. Then you have depression and reflection. Then at that point, that's the harder stages of grief, and those are the 4 main ones, and some of them are dovetailed in between, like depression and grief. So are there any of those subjects? Is there anything here that specifically deals with that book-wise, or is it just kind of going from that and then going through?
Yeah, all of these different resources cover all those different stages. I know, at least for me personally, with like guilt, like I've experienced it, whereas like my mother's best friend was terminally ill, and like because I knew she was going to pass away at some point, we didn't know when, like I wanted to distance myself from her in order to be a buffer, and I had that guilt after she passed, and I was like, I didn't spend the time that I should have with her.
Right. I woulda, shoulda, coulda. Right.
But back to books. A really great resource for children and adults is Elizabeth Hoffman's book. She wrote and illustrated it. It's really, really cute and very sweet, and just a great way to have a discussion with younger kids who are starting to ask questions, or maybe a family member has died that they're related to, and they just need some extra comfort and that sort of thing. So that's a really great book. It's Okay That You're Not Okay is another good one. Modern Loss is just a fun one because it's conversations. Conversations of different people back and forth of how they were processing it with friends and family and that sort of thing. Thank you.
We're all still learning.
And so that's a good one if you just want like short stories back and forth, that kind of thing. We have Bearing the Unbearable, which is also very good. And then
That's a funny title for this one.
Dead People Sucks, a guide for survivors of the newly departed. And there are so many more amazing resources, but just maybe a few to get you started on.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I know so much more now than I did. And one of the things, when I first started learning the protocols of Hever Kadisha and walking through different things, how I would do things now is very different than how I would have done things then.
Yeah.
So one of the things I may have touched on with you before is I lost my mother when I was 21 years old.
It's really young, yeah.
And I didn't have a lot of trusted people that I could talk with to go through my grief.
Yeah.
And that's why it's really good to start opening up these conversations, finding books like this. For a long time, I didn't think it was okay to not be okay. And I've learned a lot since then, and that's why I guess so much I've gravitated towards Hever Kadisha and the Shiva aspect is taking that time to mourn. Because when I was at my mother's funeral and I'm looking at her, it was her.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, I know it was her, but it wasn't her.
They're still,
And not learning these kind of protocols, I'm trying to work with this without crying.
It's okay to cry. There's nothing wrong with that.
But yes, I am very human. But I didn't know what I didn't know. And I spent a lot of years since I didn't work through the grief I had, missing my mom. I did a lot of the would have, should have, could have. I wish I didn't.
Oh, yeah.
I was a challenging child. And I wish I would have had the opportunity to care for her. But when you learn these kind of protocols and you start getting educated with things like this, one of the things I'm very clear on and know and understand is you can't change the past.
True.
We chose to have my mother cremated. I would have pushed a little bit harder with my siblings now to be able to do that, to have her buried instead, or one of the other different options.
Yeah.
My father, thank God, is still alive. So there's some of the things that I learned on this program.
Now you can have a conversation with him about.
Right. But it's also knowing, because I've had people when I've taught classes and things like that, they come up to me afterwards. It's like, I wish I would have known this. I would have done it different. And my response is, you did exactly what you needed to do when you did it. It's okay. We're all learning. We're all doing the best we can. Because we're human. We're learning. We do what we can. And when we find something better, we do better.
Precisely.
Right. That's all we can do, because we're always learning, always growing, always changing. And this book was another book that you brought that, you know, it's interesting. And I'm talking about my mom.
Yeah.
And this is the title that is just speaking to me. So I want
Go
you
for
to,
it.
this is your book. You've read it. You understand a little bit more about it.
This is a really good one if you've had a sudden death. I wasn't ready to say goodbye, surviving and healing of the sudden death of a loved one. And it can be very, very traumatic because, again, you weren't expecting it. I want to say it's easier when someone's terminally ill or aging, but you have a little bit of an expectation that this, yes, is going to happen, but you know, it can happen instantaneously, and then it's just like you're in shock and you don't know how to proceed or how to even move or breathe.
Right, because I mean, generally, even though we work in the realm of the death and the dying, we counsel, I'm very blessed to be able to usher people in from the point of life and let them transition until the point where they're no longer breathing. I've done that for 32 years and absolutely love it. And I will, Father willing, continue to do that. But one of the things that I will be straightforward with what you were saying is we can be prepared for anything and everything.
That's still.
But when the actual event actually happens, it's different. It becomes more real. There's little things that sometimes you might forget, or little things that you remember. And it's interesting where when death occurs, sometimes people hang on for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for some event, some person, unresolved issue to come in. And books that you have presented here are really, really good. Sometimes they're a blessing to be able to read ahead of time before the death occurs, and even talk with the one that might have a diagnosis. But also, it gets really hard because I have a friend of mine who, and I have permission to talk broad stroke and not be specific. We took care of her father-in-law in December, and he didn't have anything written down. There were a lot of challenges, and I'm led to say really quickly, since a lot of the people in our audience like to change their name to a Hebraic setting. If you do that, change it legally. Make sure all of your paperwork is
aligned. Yeah.
Done the same way, because one of the challenges that she had was what his signature wasn't the same on the deed of the house. It wasn't the same on the deed on the car,
which legally doesn't work. Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of challenges with that. And some states, when somebody passes away, that if the spouse is not on the deed to the house, then there's just seek counsel. There's things that you have to do. So try to have those things put into place ahead of time. But so she was walking through all of that stuff. She got her and her husband's advance directive. She's got those where they were filling them out and didn't have them notarized, and he died in a car accident. And she was the executor for her father-in-law. And now, because it was her husband, all of that weight fell on her. But then legally, now what happens is she can't be the executor of somebody that's inheriting something.
Oh, yeah.
There's all kinds of things that can happen. So it's much easier if these things are written down again. But then there's that whole level of grief. And being a widow, not once, but in a mourner, twice within a 3-month period of time.
Intense.
It's very, very, very intense. And trying to help people as much as possible with that. The grief that they're walking through, when we help them, when we have the opportunity to help them manage and come alongside, the best thing to do is the best you can to not judge. You should have done this, you should have done that.
It's not your place.
Is just try to walk beside, pray a lot, help them seek counsel, and to get a solid footing. Because when we do that, then the longevity of them being able to walk a somewhat stable life afterwards is much, much higher.
Correct.
And there's people, counselors, and a lot of, I know in Austin, there's a Center for Grief, and they offer classes. And since we are talking about grief, a lot of hospices in your community offer grief counseling, and they have some classes. They don't charge, and you don't have to go to that particular hospice. And it's worth checking out, so that way you get the help, you get the camaraderie.
And if you don't have access to that locally, there are online groups, there's Facebook pages, and there's Zoom calls that you can do. A lot of options, especially if you're in an isolated area and don't have community.
Right, because it's okay to talk about your loved one. It's okay to cry. It's okay to miss them. And having people in your community or paid professionals or somebody that just cares and wants to walk beside you through it is an invaluable resource, because it's okay to not be okay.
Precisely.
And to be able to come along somebody and say, I'm hurt. Do you have time to talk? I need to talk. Because we tend to think that that's not acceptable. And you will find the people that you can talk with. And you can find the people to talk with. I will just respectfully stay there. Because carrying your burden when a death occurs, carrying your burden, isolating, being on your own is hard. And especially if you're a community leader. Because if you're a community leader and you're telling everybody, no, I'm okay, let me grieve on my own, you put in that invisible wall between you and your community. You're supposed to be the leader of the community. And that's one of the things I loved about the Jewish people, is you see the rabbis, you see people in a leadership position allowing others to just come around them and just help them carry the burden.
And not isolating them.
Right, and it's beautiful, because together as a community, they're there to pick each other up. And I respect leaders, I respect leadership, but we're all human. We all have struggles, we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, and we all sometimes need that shoulder to cry on. And if you are a leader and you want, and you're challenged because of situations, still find a counselor to talk with, to be able to help, because there's those burdens that are just heavy to carry. And I know there's counselors out there, I think you know a few, that counsel leadership. And it's important for people to help other people.
Exactly.
Why? Because we're people. We're there to help each other. We're there to build a community.
Precisely.
And when, with a lot of the protocols that we talked about, when you build a community, the community grows, and you know you have each other's back, because you're running or walking quickly to them when something challenging happens, instead of running away, because you remember those that are willing to come beside you. You remember those that are saying, I know it's hard and I empathize with you. I can't fix it, but let's walk together with it. So that being said, I want to thank you all again for joining us with another session of Peaceful Passages, and very thankful for GLC and all the staff for helping us to do this.
Very much so.
So have a great day, and shalom.